Hi, everybody. Welcome to AtlasCamp. As Jonathan said, my name is Ben Speakman. I'm one of the two developers on the developer relations team in San Francisco. We also have Sam over in France. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Atlassian plugin SDK. As Jonathan mentioned, we announced it last year. We just finished version 3.0. In fact, I cut the release at one of these tables just for my talk. And we've done quite a bit of progress in the last year. So I want to do two things. I want to tell you about the SDK for those of you who may not have seen it before. And I also want to tell you a little bit about what's new. For those of you who have seen this talk before, rest assured, there are new jokes. So first, we're going to talk a little about the challenges that are involved in writing plugins for any product, really, and especially Atlassian products. We're going to talk about how the SDK addresses those challenges, how it makes it easier to write plugins. We're going to see some video of the SDK in action and how it can help you. We'll talk a bit about what's new since the last time that you may have seen it. And I'll talk at last a little about getting involved, because I want you all to understand developer relations does not mean that we just sit on the mountain and hand down things to you. We want you guys to be involved in what we do. And if something we give you does not do what you want to do, we want to be able to fix that for you. And we want to give you the power to fix that yourself. So let's start off with some challenges in writing plugins. Plugin development is tricky. There's a distinction between writing a plugin from scratch and writing a product from scratch. And what I mean by that is this. When you do a product from scratch, everything is open to you. You can choose what language, you can choose what operating system, you can choose what environment. If you're doing Java, you can choose what application server you want to use, what version of Java you want to target, all these different things. The trade-off for that power is a great deal of responsibility. You have to sort out all these details yourself, you have to figure out all this different information yourself, and it can be rather intimidating. On a plugin product, those decisions have been made for you. Atlassian has decided that Java is on this version, that Confluence is on this version, that Jira is on that version, and those are what we're going to use, and therefore those are what you're going to use. So you trade off a lot of the power of developing everything yourself for basically having someone else worry about most of the annoying, unimportant details so you can focus on getting what you want to get done. Well, this is like an implied contract between us, the product developer, and you, the plugin developer. And for this to work, there are three things that absolutely must be easy when you're writing a plugin. First of all, you have to start the product. This seems obvious, but this is sometimes pretty hard. The second thing is you have to be able to configure the product easily. Where are its log files? Where does this data go? How can I change that information? And finally, you have to be able to install the plugin into the product. These things are simple, but a lot of companies, and Atlassian sometimes as well, has had problems getting these three simple things working. So the SDK basically is to get these simple things working for you so you can get moving on your plugin. So let's have a closer look at Atlassian's situation. This is the 6 products that the plugin SDK supports, and that feature a plugin system. Now, there's some consistency here, but there's a lot of inconsistency as well. Jira has a startup.sh, Confluence has a startup.sh, Crowd has a crowd.sh. Most of them come with war versions. Fisheye and Crucible do not. So there's some inconsistency here, and if you're not new, and if you are new to the product, it's hard to understand where to start. The second challenge to talk about is configuration. The same thing applies here. Only recently did Jira get the concept of a home directory, which Confluence has had for a while. Although in Jira's case, Jira configures the home directory location by default, where Confluence does not. Inside the home directory are some files, but not all the files. For configuring Jira itself, we have the old standby of configuring web locations, where there's a properties file that you configure deep inside the web-inf. Well, if you didn't know it was there, or if you're even new to Java or new to Atlassian products, you probably don't have much chance of finding that. So even if you learn one product, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to learn the rest of the products as well. So that's not really optimal. The third challenge I spoke of was plugin installation. And this has some legacy problems in Atlassian systems as well. Jira and Confluence both had a long tradition of a certain plugin system. Last year, we brought out plugins too, put it in both products. But the rules for using them are different. And the rules for installing plugins underneath them are different. And in some cases, like Crowd and Fisheye and Crucible, they don't support plugins 1 at all. So if you had written a Jira plugin, say, 3 years ago, and you wanted to transfer that knowledge to Jira today, or even, say, Fisheye and Crucible today, you're kind of out of luck. So this is another problem that the SDK really needs to help us with. Oh, wait, and guess what? Build systems are different across all the products. Dependencies are different across all the products. Sometimes it's not even clear where to start. I want to write a Jira plugin. What do I do first? Unless you've done it before, you don't know. Unless you ask someone who's already done it, you generally don't know. You need to be an expert in the product just to get started if you don't have any help. Now, Maven, which is the build system that most of us use, and that is the heart of the SDK, helps us somewhat with this, with the notion of archetypes. But if you've never used an archetype before, you're right back to the same problem. How do I use this thing? What do all these options mean? I'll go to the Apache website for help. This is designed for Apache developers, not for Apache users. What do I do? So there's a lot going wrong. There's a lot of confusion. And it leads to this, a bunch of small headaches. Things that are not your fault. You should not have to be an expert in the product to know how to configure it, to know how to use it, to know how to develop on it. It's not your job to fix these problems, all right? It leads to what we call this slow code/test/debug cycle. This is the heart of satisfying development as we see it. You make a code change, you test that code change. If it works, you carry on to the next piece of code. If it doesn't work, you have to go and debug it and figure out why it doesn't work. This process, this loop, is the focus of optimization for all of engineering productivity. The faster we can make this loop, the more changes can happen, the more feeling of power and control you have over what you're doing, and the more you're going to enjoy what you're doing. But right now, the process is frustrating. The SDK's job is to stop that from happening. So let's talk about the SDK a bit. I spoke a second ago about what happiness is. Nietzsche has some problems. I'll be the first to admit that. But he really had a handle on what I think engineers and developers and technical people understand as happiness. Programming is a very complicated, very hard thing to do. There's millions of moving parts. There's lots of different variables, both in the literal sense and most of the things you can and can't control. And there's a lot of things going on that you don't understand and don't have the mental capacity to understand. All of us in some way stand on the shoulders of giants. Those of us who use Mac stand on the shoulders of Andy Hertzfeld and the other designers of the original Mac OS. Linux users stand on Linus Torvalds' shoulders. So basically, as you climb up this pyramid, you're able to rely on the work of more and more intelligent people to help you. That's what happiness is as a developer, is that you feel like you're not being caught up on small things. As you progress through the woods, you have your machete and you just hack your way through the undergrowth. You know where you're going, the machete is your tool, it keeps things from getting in your way. That's what happiness is, the feeling of power, the feeling that the systems respond to your commands. If the SDK does anything right, it needs to do this right. Because the more satisfying it is to use it, the more you're going to enjoy using it. So let's go back to the first challenge. Starting the product is kind of hard. Well, here's how the SDK deals with it. There's one shell script called Atlas Run. It starts the product for you. That's all you need to know. The second challenge, configuring the product. All these different configuration directories, different locations for everything. No, you don't need to worry about that. With the SDK, logs are sent to a specific place where you can predict where they're going to be. The data directories the product use are also put somewhere where you know they're going to be and can change them without having to reconfigure the entire product. And finally, the challenge of installing plugins themselves. This could not be easier, I think. When you do Atlas Run, the SDK automatically recognizes you have a plugin that you're working on and installs the plugin for you in the product. None of this stuff needs to matter to you. It just works. So let's talk about how the SDK pulls off this minor miracle. Underneath the SDK is Maven. But we'll get to that later, because what Maven does for us is basically handle a lot of the details that you don't have to. Maven helps us keep the complexity of the product away from you. So the Atlassian Maven plugin suite is what we call this group of Maven plugins that we've written. There's one plugin for each of the products. There's called Maven Jira plugin, Maven Confluence plugin, and so forth. And what they do is they give us a common interface to the products. Jira's home directory is one place, where it may be no place, depending on if it's configured or not. The plugin can configure that for you. Confluence starts a certain way, but the plugin knows how to start Confluence, so you don't have to. With this common interface, we can do cool things like put a script on top of the SDK that says Atlas-run, and the SDK runs. Everything is handled by these plugins for you. And the really cool thing is, if you've done a lot of work with Maven, you may know how complex and powerful it is. Well, these plugins are not tied to the SDK's use, which means if you want to repurpose these plugins for your own build, you can do that. We don't need to get into too much detail about this. If you've used Maven a lot, you'll know what I'm talking about. But just understand that the more you get into Maven, the more it kind of takes over your life. The SDK helps you deal with that complexity in a way that's most amenable to you and your process. Here are some of the script shortcuts that the SDK gives you. The most common tasks that all of us do every day: start the product with the current plugin installed. There's a Maven command for that. Basically, there's an amps plugin which takes goals, which can be passed to it. Most of the common goals have script shortcuts, which are basically shell or batch files that are packaged with the SDK. Basically, you would take the bin directory and add it to your path, so you can invoke it from the command line. And stuff like Atlas Run, which starts the product for you, Atlas Debug, which starts the product but also allows you to attach a debugger, boring stuff. But then it gets a little more complicated and interesting. Say you want to have, several things running and the default port for Jira, 2990, is taken by something else. That's fine. You're able to pass parameters to the shell script and to Maven to make sure it runs on a different port for you, different context path, different things like that. In fact, Atlas Run is not tied to the product you're using. If you want to run Confluence for some reason in your Jira plugin, maybe you're starting to think about cross-product plugin or something like that, you can do that. That's fine. And finally, Maven underneath is not something that we're trying to hide from you entirely. We're trying to help you use it. We're not trying to tell you it's not there. So if you want to run some complex Maven command with proprietary plugins you have or things that you use in your build that we don't use in ours, you can pass directly through to the installation of Maven from inside. And that works pretty well. So let's talk about the SDK in action. What I'm going to do is show you a little bit about how it works, and I'm going to show you some videos of the SDK in action. And I think that'll be much more clear than me trying to explain the whole thing to you. So the first piece of business is the SDK only works effectively with plugins 2 plugins. Plugins 2 came out last year. At that time, pretty much everybody was still using plugins 1. Plugins 2 is now the standard in all shipping Atlassian products. It's stable, it's battle-tested, and it works. If you're still on plugins 1, there is no reason to wait. Start using plugins 2 now. I mean it now. There's a link on this page here which will tell you where to find details to convert your plugins 1 plugin to plugins 2. In 96.4% of cases, all it is adding one line to your Atlassian plugin XML, and you're done. The more complicated cases, you got to get familiar with OSGI, but it's one of those character building experiences. It's good for you. So the first thing I like to think of with the SDK is what we call 30-second plugin creation. Starting a new project could not be simpler. It is dirt simple. There's a shell script called Atlas create product plugin, where product can be Jira, Confluence, Bamboo, what have you. This script executes what's called a Maven archetype. This archetype basically sets up a project structure for you. It creates initial source code files, sets up your initial unit tests, does some other housekeeping, creates a valid Maven POM file or project object model, which is basically Maven's build script, for lack of a better term right now. When it needs information from you, it'll automatically ask for that information. And when you create this plugin, it works directly out of the box without anything else you need to worry about. So let's take a look at how that works. This is my command line. What I'm doing here is typing that same command, Atlas create Jira plugin. Maven's going to go pull the archetype that I need. I don't need to know which archetype it's called or anything like that. It'll go and pull the one I need out of the Maven structure. Then it's going to ask me for the group ID. Think of the group ID as, categorization for Maven. Basically, when Maven stores artifacts, it's going to give it a group ID and artifact ID. So my company plugins is like the space of all my plugins. The artifact ID is going to be the specific project that I'm currently working on. It's going to ask for a version. It's going to ask for a default package, which is just where the Java classes go by default. I accept those defaults. Those are fine. And when I return, Maven's going to create the plugin for me. That took 33 seconds. It only took 33 seconds because I was typing slowly to make sure you guys could follow. But that's how easy it is to create a plugin. You're done. You can start hacking right now. OK, I can start hacking. How do I start seeing my changes and that kind of interesting stuff? That brings us to the second thing. On-the-fly code changes. I spoke a minute ago about this fast code test debug loop. The faster you get in this loop, the quicker you work in it, the more you can get done. What you do is that there's a command in the SDK to let you start what is basically a command line interface to Maven. You can issue directives to Maven through that interface without ever starting Maven or stopping Maven yourself, or without starting or restopping the product. So you find the code change you want to make, just Java. You make the code change. You reinstall the plugin from the CLI, and I'll show you how that works. The plugin goes directly into the running instance of the product. No restart necessary. The downtime is maybe 2 seconds. And that's as fast as we can possibly make this work, I think. And it works really well. So that's an example of how that works. What I have here is Confluence running from Atlas Run. So you see here I've started on port 1990. Okay. Here's Confluence. It's running currently this macro, which is in my plugin project called Demo AtlasCamp plugin. When I save this page, it's going to go ahead and render that macro for me. It's going to tell me some random information about the spaces. Now, over in this window here is Atlas CLI. As you see up here, I've typed Atlas CLI. It's basically giving me a command line interface directly to Maven. And this is how you know it's working properly. It opens the port, you can get to it, and it works. So at this point, I think, OK, now I can go make a code change. I'm going to go over here. Here's this command string. I want this to say something else. It says, hello, admin, right now. So here's the part in the Java code where that line comes from. It's just a H2 file. It's just H2 line that says, hello, user, whatever. Well, let's be friendly and say, hello, user, coming from AtlasCamp. And I made a typo, because that's what I do. We'll go up. We'll save the file. We'll go back over here. We'll reload. Nothing has changed, because the change of my local machine did not affect the plugin running inside Confluence. I need to reinstall the plugin. So I go to the CI. I type this command called PI, which stands for plugin install. You're going to see Maven's going to compile the plugin for me. Then it's going to upload that plugin back into Confluence. And you see the execution time there, 1.7 seconds. That's the time you have to wait before you can see your change. So over in my Confluence one where it says Atlas Run, you can see I've uploaded this new plugin. Confluence has seen the plugin has been uploaded. So now I can go over my browser. I can click Reload. And that's it. 2 seconds for a Java change in a running system with no restart or anything like that. I think that's pretty good. Let's talk about auto-resource reloading. Plugin development is not just Java. Plugin development is also XML. Plugin development is also resources like CSS or JavaScript or images, stuff like that. Well, we can actually do a clever thing with the plugin system. Because these things aren't actually code, CSS, JavaScript, they're not code that runs inside the product, the plugin system doesn't mind if we change those resources out from underneath it while it's running. So the SDK monitors your project directory for these resources. So if it sees that your XML or your JavaScript or your CSS or whatever has changed, it can reload that directly into the running browser without anything else being affected. Reload the browser, see the changes, get the girl, repeat. This could not be any faster. So let's take a look at how this works in an example that you may remember if you're doing an open social gadget on the Jira dashboard. So let's take a look at this. I have Jira running here on the default port from Atlas Run. I don't have the CLI up or anything. I'm going to do this entirely through the browser. So the first thing I'm going to do is reload Jira to make sure that Atlas Run is still working. Just to prove to you I'm not fibbing here. OK, now I want to add the gadget I'm working on. Eventually, there we go. The gadget I'm working on is called the Test Jira Tutorial Gadget. You may recognize this as one of the tutorials I wrote for doing a gadget last year. I'm going to add the gadget to the dashboard. There it is. A gadget, if you don't know, is just a combination of some XML markup and HTML or JavaScript. So here's the actual source code of the gadget. There's that line that's showing up inside the gadget right there. It's just straight HTML. There's nothing fancy here. There's no hidden tricks. So I'll make this gadget more friendly as well. I'll go in here and type hello AtlasCamp. OK, great. I want to see it. I go up. I save the file. I'm going to tab back over to my browser. I'm going to reload. And there it is. Now just imagine if you were doing this without wanting to show it to a bunch of people who had never seen it before. If you want to change your JavaScript, I mean, it's as fast as you can press reload on your browser. You could even make a ping loop in your browser to reload every 10 seconds if you wanted to, if you really hated clicking reload. But I mean, the only limitation here on you, as far as improving this code, is how fast you want to work on it, not us. Finally, let's talk about one of the key things inside Maven, the SDK, is what we call this boxed Maven. Inside the SDK, as I mentioned before, is a standalone, isolated Maven 2.1.0 instance. This Maven instance has been automatically configured to read the Atlassian repositories by default. So there's no extra configuration needed on your part. Back in the day, some of you may remember, we used to wear a t-shirt that says, have you configured your settings XML? Settings XML is not your problem anymore. There's one inside the Maven that takes care of it for you that has the correct settings. And if that ever changes, we don't see it having to change. But if it did ever change, we could change it ourselves, release a new version of the SDK, you download and install it, and that's it. And you're ready to go. The cool thing about this Maven is that while it does these cool things for you that I've shown you, like the shell scripts and stuff, it's also usable on its own. So if you want to pass plugin goals directly into Maven, you want to call your own plugins, like I said with the Atlas Maven script earlier, you can still do that. It'll just take whatever you pass it and send it right through, and the fact that it lives inside the Atlassian SDK is no impediment to you having to worry about configuring or using your Maven on your own. So it's pretty simple. So I promised some what's new. And aside from the lame jokes, there are some new things that have come out in the SDK the past year and 6 months that I think are really interesting and really essential to people who want to use the SDK developed plugins. So let's see what some of those are. First one is what I'm calling external home directories. And I apologize for the names of some of these features. It's not very intuitive. I'm not a product marketer, but now that we have Alex, maybe you can think of something more catchy to call them. The first thing is an external home directory. Think of when Jira gets installed, it creates a directory, this Jira home directory that I've talked about, that contains, for example, the HSQL database that starts the evaluation. It contains all your log files, everything that's specific to this instance of Jira that makes it special from every other instance of Jira. Once you have that, you can use a command in the SDK to create an archive of that directory. Then, in your POM for your existing plugin project using the SDK, with one line of code, you can change that so that when Jira starts from the SDK, it doesn't start from scratch with nothing in it, but it automatically populates itself with the data from the archive. This is really cool, for example, if you have a separate Jira installation for testing, and you've managed to find a bug on your testing machine that you can't reproduce on your development machine, and you don't want to make available to leak through to production. You can create an archive of your test machines, issues, projects, whatever. Feed that to your SDK. Reproduce the problem, and make sure that works. And finally, thanks to Jonathan DeKlovic, who is our first external contributor to the SDK, who coded this up for us, and it's so useful that we use it every day now. So he did a great job. In fact, he'll be doing a little lightning talk later today, as I understand, or possibly tomorrow, I'm not sure. One of those days. He's going to talk more about how to use this and some examples of it. And I highly encourage all of you to spend the 5 minutes required to check that out. You'll be very glad you did. Second cool thing is what I'm calling test groups. By default, when you're running tests over a project, what you have are a list of tests that run no matter what. I mean, JUnit gives you some ability to exclude things you don't want to run, and you can trigger those from Maven, but it's kind of hard. I mean, it's a pain to set up. It's a pain to configure in Maven. So we have this thing called test groups, which make it easier. Imagine that you want to write a group of tests for all your supported products. So let's say you're running a cross-product plugin. OK, here's Jira, here's Confluence. There are some things that Jira doesn't have that Confluence has, and vice versa. And there are some things that are in the plugin core code that just need to work no matter what product it's on. You can now create test groups to isolate those changes. Once you have the test groups defined, you can run them individually, you can run them in combination, or you can run none of them at once or all of them at once. It's just like if you're on your integration machine, your continuous integration machine, and you want to run all your tests to make sure your build is intact. The integration team in San Francisco did this all the time when they were working on the Universal Plugin Manager. So this is extremely powerful, indispensable for doing cross-product stuff. I'd also like to talk about multiple version testing. For those of you who don't know, this is Frank Grimes. Frank Grimes is the plugin developer, and Homer is developer relations. This conversation has happened many times. Why did you break Jira 4 after Jira 3.13? Or why did you break the search API in 3 consecutive releases of Confluence? These are questions I sometimes have no good answer for, so I just sit there and smile. Well, we can help you a little bit with that now. Imagine you want to run the same test group against multiple versions of the product. Jira 4.0, Jira 4.1, Jira 4.2, and oh, by the way, Jira 4.3 eventually to make sure your changes are not going to break in something new. You can do that now by saying, OK, run this test group SDK against these 4 versions. The same test, same environment, tear it down, build it up from scratch, and run all the tests, and tell me what changes. This is a big step toward solving the question of why does it work in Jira 4 but not 4.2. So anybody who wants to keep their plugins maintainable and fresh to work with the latest versions of products should be very interested in what you're seeing here. And finally, I'll talk about this feature that I'm calling co-installs. Sometimes when you're working on a plugin or someone's doing any Java development, there's other things you need in there to run, like a proprietary testing library. People have them. Proprietary debugger. Say that your plugin needs to talk to something fancy like a source control system, and the library is proprietary, so you can't just take any old library and stick it in there. You have to have a very specific jar, which has a very specific license in it. This has happened to me on a couple occasions as well. What you can do is tell the SDK, whenever you install my plugin into the product, when I do Atlas Run, install my plugin in the product, but also take these other libraries and install them as well. That way, when the product comes up, the SDK will make sure it's in a valid state, and all of your other additions will work just as well. And again, this can be applied to other Atlassian plugins, as well as just random jars that you may want to stick in there. So as far as a quick and dirty dependency mechanism to get your plugin development working faster, this is very cool. And finally, I want to talk a bit about how to get involved in the Atlassian SDK. Be the change you seek is one of our values. And we try to live it both in our dealings with the external community as well as our dealings with the internal one. So here's what's going on with the SDK. Understand the SDK is open source. It's protected by the Apache license 2.0. What that means is anybody is free to use it, download it, make changes. If you make changes, you are not required to send them back to us if for some reason you live under some draconian NDA with your employer. If you can, we'd love to have them. And many of our good changes from the SDK have come from people who have said, hey, I hacked this together, try this. Does this work well for you guys? But you are not required to if you don't need to or you can't. The SDK updates with the products. There's a Jira 4.2 release just around the corner. There's going to be a new SDK the day of the Jira 4.2 release with support for 4.2 in it. And in most cases, support for a new product in the SDK basically means we change one line in one property file, and all of a sudden your new projects use Jira 4.2. That doesn't mean you're required to use 4.2, of course, but it means when you start from scratch, you have the option of starting with the latest product available, which helps you a lot when it comes to compatibility and things like that. As well as that, there's already outside people who are looking at the SDK code and contributing to it. So it's not just Dan and I working on this, although sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes Don chips in with things from Sydney. Sometimes Sam, working over in France, will throw some things in. All kinds of fun things. So there's work going on in there. And we'd love for you to be a part of it. So how can you help out? On studio.atlassian.com, which we call Stack internally, there's a project called AMPS. If you guys are on your browsers right now, I encourage you to go check it out, bookmark it, take a look. There are some things we need help with right now that you guys can help us with. First of all is the easy one, documentation. We do our best, but we're never able to document things exactly the way people want them to. Well, now you can help us. If there's something in the SDK you want to use or want to change but don't understand how, ask us for help or figure out how to do it in the right documentation yourself. If it's good, we'll put it in the official documentation. The official documentation is right there on that Stack page. Change the page and you're in. It's just that simple. Testing on Windows. Atlassian has a bunch of Mac geeks. I use Linux. No one uses Windows. If you're stuck on Windows and it doesn't work for you, help us figure out why. I've heard reports of it, but I've never been able to duplicate it myself. So if you do have problems with that, figure it out and let me know. And finally, there's always features going on you can help with right now. One thing you're going to hear about from Sam, I believe it's tomorrow, is per plugin storage. The idea that a plugin will be able to store things in the product database that are related only to its needs and no one else has to worry about. It's pretty exciting stuff, and I'm looking forward a great deal to Sam's talk. So I encourage you to go to that talk as well to see how you might be able to help out with that feature. So what do we talk about in this little long-winded exposition? The SDK makes plugin and gadget creation easier. That's what it does. That's what it's good at. It works for us. It can work for you. It works for every product Atlassian supports that has a plugin system, and that's all of them right now. The code test debug cycle. The faster that spins, the more productive you are. We make it spin as quickly as possible so everybody can get what they need to get done as quickly as possible. The SDK integrates you tightly with Atlassian structure. Atlassian has a horribly complex Maven system. Mike talked to a guy last year who told him, you guys do more with Maven than anybody I've ever seen. Did I mention this guy works for Sonatype? Sonatype are the guys who actually write Maven themselves. You think their Maven structure would be pretty hairy, but apparently it's got nothing on us. That integration works. It's taken care of for you. You don't need to worry about it. And finally, the SDK is flexible enough to work inside your system. If you want to use the shell scripts, that's great. We use them too. If you want to hook Maven directly into your Maven system so that it works for you, that's fine. You can use the plugins outside of Maven entirely. If you're that kind of wizard and you're the kind of person who doesn't like a framework telling you what to do, you can do that as well. But the SDK solves these problems for you and a lot more. And finally, here are some interesting resources that you might want to type up to see running plugins, how to market your plugins, how to host your plugins. We'll host them for you on Stack or on Bitbucket, which you may have heard we recently acquired. We're pretty proud of that. And if you want to get a hold of developer relations directly, you can email us. There's a chat channel on IRC that we idle in whenever we're at work. Sometimes I'm in San Francisco, sometimes Donna's in Sydney, but usually there's someone there who can probably help you with your question. And that is it. Thank you guys. Any questions?